Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist, is in the dominant position in the Democratic presidential primary. And here to discuss that as well as other matters, coronavirus and so forth, is a very special person, a Harvard classmate of mine, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Senator Tom Cotton, welcome to Breitbart News Sunday.
Hey, Joel. It's good to be on with you.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor. Now, look, I didn't mean to start with Bernie Sanders there, but you and I have known each other for a while, and I was probably the kind of kid in college who would have liked Bernie Sanders and would have supported Bernie Sanders. I probably would have voted for Bernie Sanders and more. So I've come full circle. I know we like to joke about that, but how would you explain to 19-year-old me why doing that, why supporting Bernie Sanders would be a bad idea?
Joel, it is true that you probably might have been a Bernie bro back in college, whereas I think you would tell your entire audience that I was what you might say right from the beginning. Look, I think you'd simply say to college students or young people today what President Trump has now said repeatedly in his State of the Unions: America will never be a socialist nation. I understand that, especially for people who are, say, under the age of 20, under the age of 25, that they've faced some tough times in their life. You know, they've had friends who've been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. They saw their parents sometimes lose their jobs, even lose their homes in the recession, might have struggled to get jobs themselves coming out of that recession. But the way that we can make sure that they get back on their feet and live the life of promise that their parents and their grandparents lived is not through socialism. It's not through the simple but false promises that Bernie Sanders is making. It's through the kind of economic progress we've made in these last 3 years. You know, whenever you let people keep more of their own money, you tell the government dictates less to them, you stop bringing in lots of unskilled and low-skilled immigrants to take their jobs. Lo and behold, what happens? We have a strong economy with more people at work than we've ever had before, with wages for working-class folks growing faster than they ever have before. That's the way that we move the country forward. Socialism is the way that we turn the country into Venezuela.
Right. Now, you mentioned the economic growth and the strong performance of the economy. Many Trump supporters are looking at the coronavirus outbreak and wondering if that could prove a bigger challenge than Bernie Sanders in 2020. Although it's been relatively contained so far, no one knows where this is going to go. And in a sense, the administration seems to be in a catch-22, because if you have the president on TV every night taking charge and looking like he's taking it very seriously, it sends a signal that this is a very serious problem and we don't really have it under control after all. But if he says nothing about it, people assume he isn't doing anything about it. You have been on top of this issue since day one, and I commend you for that. Tell us where we are with coronavirus, what we need to be thinking about, and is this a problem that our government is going to be able to handle?
Well, first, Joe, I can tell you the president is very much on top of the threat that we face from coronavirus. In fact, probably every conversation I've had with him for the last month has involved, at least in part, coronavirus, to include in mid-January when I urged the administration to stop travel from China, and the president very boldly and decisively shut down that travel. That was a big decision. That was the decision President Obama was not willing to make about the Ebola crisis in 2014. But he is engaged, and he is directing a very aggressive effort to prevent any further outbreaks in what we have in the country right now, because ultimately the most important thing is the health, safety, and security of the American people. There may indeed be some economic effects. We can't deny that. We don't know how severe it will be, but if there is any economic effects, China will be 100% to blame for those effects, because they have been so dishonest and corrupt and deceitful from the very beginning that this virus started breaking out in late November and early December. I'm confident that the American worker, American farmer, the American rancher can fight through it. Even if there is something of an economic slowdown because of coronavirus, it won't be nearly as bad here as it is in China. But we do have to be prepared for that possibility, while recognizing the most important thing is protecting the health and safety of our people.
Do you think there's an effect? Obviously, there is the infection rate to worry about, the possibility people here could spread the disease. But the other thing people are really worried about is those supply chains in China, the products, the inputs that American factories often depend on for finished products. Sometimes the factories that are producing imports that retailers depend on. We're starting to see a few of those ripples through the economy. Do you think that's going to be a big challenge going forward?
Yeah, Joel, that's probably right now the biggest threat the economy faces. Is not so much the chains themselves, the ships or the aircraft that are moving around the world, but the supply into those chains, because so much of the world's basic output comes from China, like 1/6 or 1/7 of it. And many of those factories are idled. China was in the Chinese Lunar New Year shutdown of most of their work sites when this virus started, and many of those work sites have not restarted since then. So if we see early economic effects, it'll probably be because the supply chains stop having things supplied into them. Because many people in China are just not going back to work. Many factories are just idled in China, given the rampant and fast pace of the outbreak on mainland China.
All right, so we've dealt with politics a little bit, Bernie Sanders. We've dealt with coronavirus. Now, let's talk about the emerging foreign policy situation. Democrats avoided the topic entirely in the debate they had in Nevada, and that was curious. There was only one economic question, and it was very local. It was about Reno and Las Vegas and global warming, really, because the questioner assumed that these places which are naturally hot were going to become unbearably hot, which they already are, for some of the year anyway, and so forth. It wasn't really a serious economic question, but I'll give them that. Nothing on foreign policy at all. And yet they're turning to Bernie Sanders, who promises to shake up American foreign policy in the complete opposite way that President Donald Trump has done. Then you've got our friend Rick Grinnell taking over as acting director of national intelligence. What is the current state of affairs with American foreign policy? Is it so good that Democrats don't want to talk about it, or is it so shaky that we need to be worried about all these cabinet reshuffling?
Well, Joel, wasn't that remarkable that in that entire debate, they didn't talk at all about the safety and security of this country, the kind of military we need, or the kind of strategy we need to offset a long-term adversary like China. Also, since we talked about coronavirus, how about the fact that they didn't even discuss a virus that could emerge as a global pandemic? This is in keeping with what the Democratic Party has done for a year. They've been so obsessed with their own fascinations, their own obsessions in Washington, D.C. Just look at the impeachment trial we went through, that they are not speaking to normal voters' concerns about their health when it comes to coronavirus, or their safety and security when it comes to our military or China or Iran, for instance. And I do think the Democrats recognize that the president has been a very strong and effective leader for this country. Just look at what happened last month when, to the surprise of the Democrats and probably to the surprise of the Ayatollahs in Tehran, he killed Iran's terrorist mastermind, the number 2 official in that country, who had the blood of hundreds of Americans on his hand. And then look at the changes he has brought about in our China policy. For 20 or more years, leaders in both parties, regrettably, didn't take the China threat seriously. And Donald Trump has completely remade American China policy, so much so that most Democrats now would probably be, to his left, whether it's on trade or human rights or security or what have you. But I thought it was very telling that the Democrats didn't discuss either foreign policy or their coronavirus in the debate last week.
Senator Cotton, I know we only have you for a short while, but let me just get your reaction before you leave to the extraordinary dissent by Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor yesterday in the 5-4 decision about allowing the Trump administration to continue to exclude immigrants who would become public charges, who would have to depend on welfare and so forth. 5-4, the Supreme Court upheld the Trump administration's rule, which really upheld the traditional approach that had been practiced for, I guess, over a century in the United States. Sonia Sotomayor comes out in her dissent and says, essentially, that Republican-appointed judges are simply siding with Trump. What was your reaction when you read that or heard about it?
Yeah, so, Joe, I've read her dissent, and this is a classic example of the president's critics and opponents projecting onto him exactly what they and the other critics are doing. So she accused the Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court of taking extraordinary steps to side with the administration and allow them to implement their agenda, when in fact it is all of these resistance judges appointed by Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or even Jimmy Carter who are issuing these crazy nationwide injunctions without a factual record in front of them that are actually taking unprecedented action. The Supreme Court is simply stepping in and saying they've had enough with a single judge who's probably been shopped at for by left-wing plaintiffs, shutting down what is a basic regulation that should move forward. And on the merits of this case, the so-called public charge rule, that immigrants should not be allowed into this country if they will become a public charge, if they will use welfare or use food stamps or use Medicaid. That is probably the oldest principle of American immigration law. You know, in the 18th and 19th century, we didn't have much in the way of immigration law, certainly not like we have now. There were very few laws at all governing immigration in those days. One of those laws, though, was that you cannot come to this country and become a burden on the public treasury. I mean, that's just plain common sense. And it's high time that the Trump administration was allowed to implement their regulation that has been blocked by all these left-wing resistant judges.
Senator Tom Cotton, thank you so much for your time and for appearing on Breitbart News Sunday. We look forward to the week ahead and following political developments along with you. And good luck indeed in helping the administration deal with coronavirus. That's something that affects all of us, Democrat, Republican, Bernie bro, or MAGA hat wearing Trump supporter alike. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you, Joe.